Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot Daf Ayin Aleph. Today's daf is sponsored by Tzivya Maureen in honor of Charlotte on her 20th birthday. To our Daf Yomi champion Charlotte, we love you. Mazal Tov. Always impressive when we have young people learning Daf Yomi. Also impressive older people. All of it is impressive. Okay, we're going to get started. Amar le Rabbi Elazar. I don't know how other people are feeling, but especially during this difficult time, I find learning Daf Yomi is definitely a very strong anchor in my day and keeps me kind of focused on something, at least for part of the day. Not always thinking about sirens. It's like my 1 hour that I've kind of put that out of my head until, of course, it happens. Anyway, let's get going. Amar le Rabbi Elazar le Rabbi Yoshaya Didari. So we started with this idea of hashrasha, how when the vegetable, or when the crops, not the vegetables, the crops, the grains take root, if it took root before the Omer, which we saw a bit of a machloket about which part, the morning, before the day starts, but when it takes root, that already means that it's going to be part of the chadash that we're going to permit for this year, and it's not next year's produce, that we have to wait a whole year to be able to eat. So Rabbi Elazar says to Rabbi Yoshia Didare, this is just, Didare means of his generations, just so we don't confuse which Rabbi Yoshia. Okay, it wasn't talking to Rabbi Yoshia who lived in the time of the Tanaim. He's talking about the Rabbi Yoshia who's in Amora. Okay, kind of obvious because Rabbi Elazar was also not living in the time of the Tanaim, but okay. Lo teitav akarich, don't sit down. Ad mefrash ala lahamatnitin. I want to understand the basis for this Mishnah. Minayin la'omer shematir bas rasha. How do we know that the Omer is matir anything that had already taken root by the time of the Omer? Where do we get that it's taken root? That's the issue. I'm going to end up with 4 different answers to this question, and even the 4th one, I'm going to reject each one as we go through. Even the 4th one we're going to have an issue with, but we're going to resolve, and then in the end that will be our answer. So minayin la'omer shematir bas rasha. So he says, minalan. What do you mean minalan? It's obvious the answer. Dichtiv aviv. Okay, so let's go to the pasuk if you remember. V'im takriv mincha bikurim laHashem. If you're going to bring in mincha bikurim, which we learned is talking about the Omer. This is in last week's parsha Vayikra. Aviv kaloi ba'esh geras karmel takriv mincha bikurecha. Bring it aviv. What is aviv? Ripe. So now it says, go take it from the ripe product. If you say go take it from the ripe grain, what does it seem to imply? Lav michlal diika de lav aviv. Well, if they tell you go choose the ripe one, it means that there must be ones that aren't ripe. So if there aren't ones that are ripe, it means that there's other chadash that we can't bring for the Omer, but the Omer will permit it. So what is that? Well, under ripe must be hashrasha. Okay, that's really, there's a wide gap between not ripe and take root, right? If we make a scale of where is the seed at this point, right, that's very wide. That's not a great answer, to which the Gemara rejects and says, Dilma, there's a word missing there. It should be Dilma. We're going to have it missing a few times here. Dilma de lav aviv, ulolam de ayos shlish. Okay, there's a difference between, maybe you'll say, what Aviv is trying to say is, there might be crops that have come to, right, that it might not be Aviv, but it already is a third of the way grown. It's just not ripe yet, right? There's a lot between ripe, again, there's a lot between taking root and fully ripe. So what we're saying is take the fully ripe product as opposed to all the others that have already reached a third of their growth. This is a big thing we're going to talk about today a lot, especially at the end of the daf, about a third of its growth. It's reached a third of its growth, which means it's edible, but it's not really there. So that could be what it's saying. But maybe then only, if you would infer it from there, you'd say the Omer only permits things that are a third of the growth. So that's not what we're looking for. So that's not going to help. Ela Amar Shmuel. So Rabbi Yoshia didn't really come up with a good answer. Ela Amar Shmuel. Shmuel gives an answer. Mehechel Charmesh, a different pasuk. Right? It says, Shiva Shavuot Tispor Lach, go count your 7 weeks. Mehechel Charmesh B'Kamal. When do you start? When the sickle goes into the standing grains. So now we're going to focus on this Charmesh, the sickle. La Bichlal D'ika La Ber Charmesh. So now we're going to say, right, what do you reap with a sickle? Crops that are ready for eating, which are a third of the way. Which means that, what does it mean? It means, again, just like the Aviv, well, take something that's at least a third of the way grown, but don't take from things that are less than a third, but are already going to be permitted by this. Again, there's all the bigger group of what's permitted, and then there's the subset of, well, you can only take this for the Omer. So now we're going to say, so only take this for the Omer, but anything less than that, like under a third, should be fine. Now, under a third must be talking about Hashrasha. So now they're going to say again, what do you mean? There's a wide gap still between, we're going to keep doing the same thing, between Hashrasha, taking root, and under a third, right? It takes a while to get from taking root till it's just under a third. So therefore they say, Udilma de la bar charmesh olam shachat. What's shachat? Shachat is fodder, animal fodder. Meaning the stalks have grown. There's just no grains on them yet. But the stalks have grown. So it could be under a third, but there's stalks. If it just takes root, there's nothing growing that you can see out of the ground. So basically, if it's la bar charmesh, you're not going to use it for the sickle, but it still could be, right, standing up stalks. So, and that's not taking root, that's not Hashrasha, that's a way earlier stage. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak, third option, kama, the next word in the pasuk, me'achel charmesh bakama, the standing wheat. Okay, so now you see each one goes back to the previous. So it has to be standing. So now they say, standing implies that lav michal de lav bar kama, that there's some that aren't standing. What is that? If it's not standing, it must be because it hasn't yet grown, but it has taken root. And that would teach us Hashrasha. That again, there's the big set of everything that's Chadash, and within that, you can only choose the one that's standing. But it still means that the Omer is going to permit all the other stuff, which is from Hashrasha. But they say, no, Dilma de la bar kama lo olam agam. What's an agam? It's like a marsh. Now, what grows in a marsh? Often you have these. Now they start off, growing out of the ground, but they bend down. They're very soft, and they bend over. And maybe kama means take it from the standing, not the ones that have grown but are bent over, which again means doesn't include Hashrasha. It doesn't get you all the way back down to, even Hashrasha is considered Chadash. So final answer, Ela Amarava Asher Tizra. Okay, here's a different pasuk. It's a little bit of a tricky one because it's not talking about the Omer, but we'll talk about it in a minute. This is in Shmot Kaf Gimel. Chag HaKatzir Bikurei Ma'asecha Asher Tizra B'Sadeh. The Chag HaKatzir is the time when you bring your Bikurim. Okay, this is Shavuot, not the Omer. Okay, Asher Tizra B'Sadeh. The Bikurim, right, the first fruits that you planted. Now, remember that the Shtei Alechem that you bring on Shavuot is from the new crop, and it permits the new crop on the altar. So they say, this is like the Omer that permits the new crop. It's the same new crop we're discussing. For the Omer permits it for people to eat, and the Shtei Alechem permits it for sacrifices on the altar. So now we're going to say, what language does it use? It uses plant. Plant already seems like take root, because then it's very early. So now it seems to say it's the first of the things you planted, which means that it's the first one that grew among all the other Chadash, which was already planted before, we're going to assume before the Omer. So there's one problem with this, right? So he says, Misha Atzriya, right? So Asher Tizra, Misha Atzriya. So therefore, we finally get it, that it's from the time it's planted. But Amarle Rav Papa, Rav Papa says to Rav, you have a problem. Yihachi, Avagav Deloish Rishnami. Wait a minute. Planting is an earlier stage. Before we kept saying that the stage is too late, right? It doesn't necessarily imply taking root. Now we're saying the stage is too early. Planting is before it takes root. Takes root means you didn't just put a seed in the ground. The seed actually took root in the ground. So that's not what this pasuk says. This pasuk says Asher Tizra. You just said it means from the time it was planted. Now, that's not what the Mishnah says. The Mishnah says if you planted it before the Omer, but it hadn't taken root, it's not considered the Chadash that's permitted by the Omer. So that we have an easy answer. Amarlo Sudani calls him Talmid Chacham. He says that's a word for like, so you know the secrets. Basadektiv. He says back to him, it says in the field, Asher Tizra Basadeh. Now, what does it mean if you plant in the field? Now, you could say plant in the field means you planted it, but no, it becomes in the field. When does a plant, something you planted, a seed, become in the field? When it takes root. So that's where he gets to takes root. So Asher Tizra Basadeh is the pasuk we use in the end to say that's where we learn it takes root. Now, obviously, we only got here at the end because this pasuk was about Shavuot. It wasn't even about the Omer, so it was less intuitive, but it does make sense to connect them, as I explained before. Okay, new Mishnah. Now, this Mishnah is an interesting Mishnah. It's going to have a few sections. The first is, we talked about this before, when we talked about the people selling in the shuk. How did they harvest? Because you're not allowed to harvest until the Omer. Well, we said there were some ways that you can harvest, and here we're going to see the same ones we discussed then. The Gemara hadn't, but we mentioned it. And we're going to see some more. ways that it's permitted to harvest before the Omer. Kutzrim beit hashlachim sheba'amakim. You can harvest in the irrigated fields because remember, you can't use them for the Omer. They're not as good produce. And the other thing we talked about is if we don't let you harvest them, they're going to get ruined. If you leave them too long in the fields, they'll dry out. They won't be good anymore. They'll over-ripen. We don't want them over-ripening, so they permitted to do that. Aval lo godshim. But they don't allow them to make piles of them, okay, which is a later stage in the process because once you make the piles, then you'll end up making food out of it and then you'll end up eating them. So they said, yes, you can harvest them because that's where there's the loss. There's no loss after that if you don't go ahead with the process. Once you cut them, it's fine. Anshe Yericho, now we're going to talk about Anshe Yericho. We'll get back to them in the Gemara. Anshe Yericho, the people in Jericho, Kutzlim, Birtzon Chachamim. By the way, we saw this in a Sugim Psachim. This was quoted. They would harvest, and that was fine with the rabbis. Vigodshim shelo birtzon chachamim. But then they would pile them up. Okay, probably they had a lot of fields that were irrigated fields in Jericho, and they harvested them. That was fine with the rabbis, but then they put them in piles, and that was not fine with the rabbis. V'lo michu b'yadam. However, the rabbis did not stop them. They didn't protest. This is a fascinating thing, right? Anyone who's a parent or a child knows the relationship between, parent and child, and the parent chooses, where am I going to fight my battles? Where am I not going to fight my battles, right? What's worth making an issue of what's not? So the rabbis weren't pleased with this. On the other hand, they didn't protest their actions. Okay, they didn't come out and say, you cannot do this. Okay, that's called choosing your battles. Kotzer l'shachat umachil lebehema. Now we're at the next heter. So the first heter was the beit hashlachim, the irrigated fields. The second one is you can cut for your animals. That's not called, and this is going to be very important in the last part of today's sugya, and so get this in your head right now. Reshit ketzirchem, the first of your harvesting has to be the omer. So basically what they're going to say is if you cut fodder for animals, that's not considered ketzira. It's not harvesting, okay? Because that's not what to harvest for yourself to eat. So now, we have an opinion here of Tanakama. You can be kotzer l'shachat uma achil l'be'ema and feed your animal. Amar Rabbi Yehuda, but comes Rabbi Yehuda and he says, Eimatai, when is this? Now, before we go on, I'm just going to tell you, there's a Gemara in Sanhedrin, and later something in the Sugya will be based on this, so I want you to know it now. There's a Gemara in Sanhedrin that says it was actually about the gambler, and the gambler can't be a witness, and then there was a whole question, is that only if it's their only occupation? And then they said, Rabbi Yehuda came and said, Eimatai, it's only when they only have an occupation, that's their occupation, and not like if you go one-off. And then they said, whenever Rabbi Yehuda says me'ematai, ematai, he's basically explaining the previous opinion, not disagreeing. Okay? So the assumption here is that this is all one opinion. The rabbi said you do it for shachat, and Rabbi Yehuda said that's only bizman shematchil ad shelo hevi shlish. It's only if you harvested it before it got to a third. So you basically cut it for your animals. It's not going to be ktsira, the beginning of your ktsira. It's going to be permitted, but not if it already reached a third of its growth. If it reached a third of its growth, even if you're doing it for animals, it's not okay. Meaning, it's called ktsira at that point. Anything that reaches a third of its growth, even if your intent is to do it for animals, it doesn't matter. It's forbidden. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon Omer, yiktzor v'yachil af mishevi shlish. Rabbi Shimon doesn't care. He says, listen, you're doing it for animals, doesn't matter. It could be a past shlish. So he disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, and as Rabbi Yehuda is explaining Tanakama, they think until a third. Rabbi Shimon says even past a third. If you're doing it for your animals, that's not called ktsira. You're allowed to do it, and you're not ruining your omer being the first of your harvesting, because harvesting is for humans, not for animals. The kotzrim, that was heter number 2. Heter number 3, which there was a debate about. Heter number 3, kotzrim mipnei nitiot. If you have young trees and the crops are growing near and they're going to ruin your trees because your trees aren't getting enough nourishment, you're allowed to cut them. This is like we can cut it for the sake of something else. Because that's not called ktsira again. You're not cutting it for the sake of the grains, you're cutting it because you need the trees to grow better. Or mipnei beit ha'evel, or mipnei bitul beit hamidrash. Or for a house of mourners, or because of the beit, if you have no space for the beit midrash. In other words, this is like in muktzah. You're allowed to move something if you need the space, right? So you're allowed to cut it if you need the space. That's not called harvesting. It's just you're trying to get a flat area that doesn't have anything growing so people could actually use it for visiting mourners or for learning Torah. Okay, now that's the first section. So we had the irrigated field, we had the animal, cutting it for your animals, we had so you don't ruin the trees around it, these young saplings, and for the space. Lo ya'aseu tan krichot. Now when you are allowed to, don't bundle them, like tie them together. They would tie them in the bundles together. You just leave them in a big, you can pile them on top of each other, in a kind of messy manner, but don't start tying the bundles together. Mitzvah ha'omer lavo min hakama. Okay, now we're going to have the next section of the Mishnah is all these things that should be, ideally, you should do it this way, but if you can't, you can do it in the other manner. So, mitzvah ha'omer lavo min hakama should come from standing grains. Lo matzah, meaning cut them from the fields as they're standing. But lo matzah yavim min ha'omarim. But if already, for some reason, now it's a little hard to understand, we just said you're not allowed to harvest, but let's say that everything was harvested somehow, so fine, you can do it anyway, okay? It's not going to prevent you from doing the mitzvah. Obviously, the best way to do the mitzvah is to harvest it. But if it was already all harvested and it was in piles, so you can take it from there. Second, mitzvato lavo min halach. It should come from moist, because Carmel, remember we said it has to be lach, soft. We said it was rach, which is soft, which is also lach, moist. Lo matzah yavi yavesh. If not, you could bring dry ones. Mitzvato l'ktor b'layla. Remember, we learned that from the drasha. We learned when's the ideal time you're supposed to harvest it, the night of Tet Zayin b'Nisan. Niktzar bayom kasher, but if you didn't do it at night and you do it the next morning, it's fine. Ve'dochet haShabbat. We'll see in tomorrow's daf this whole discussion. What's dochet Shabbat? The harvesting or only the bringing the sacrifice? Obviously, bringing the sacrifice is done anyway on Shabbat. The question is, do you have to do the ktsira specifically on Tet Zayin, even if it's Shabbat and it overrides Shabbat? Or the ktsira is just a prep, to make sure you have what you need for the sacrifice, so maybe you should do that before. So we'll get into a discussion about that. Now we start with the Gemara. The Gemara starts off with a contradiction in the Psukim. Okay, it's actually one Pasuk, even though he kind of makes it sound like it's two Psukim, but it's part of all one, the same Pasuk. Tanya. Braita says, Rabbi Binyamin Omer, Katuv Echad Omer, Uktsartem et Ktsira, Vehevetem et Omer. So it says, harvest your crop, which sounds like do your whole harvest, Vehevetem et Omer, and then bring the Omer. So it sounds like you're going to harvest your whole field, and then you're going to take maybe from the first one and bring it. But then it says in the same, right after that, Uktiv Reshik Tzirchem ala Kohen. The first of your harvest, you bring it to the Kohen. So now they say, right, so it sounds like you don't harvest everything. You do the first harvest, bring the Omer, and then you can harvest everything else, which is what we know from what we learned. You're not allowed to harvest your whole crop before. You just harvest what you need, bring it, and only after that are you permitted to harvest. So how do we resolve this contradiction where the first pasuk makes it sound like, okay, harvest all your crop, and then after that bring the Omer? HaKetzad, how does this work? Mimakom she'ata mevi i'ata kotzel. Mimakom she'ata mevi i'ata kotzel. If it's a place where you're going to bring the Omer, then you're not, if it's a field that you can bring the Omer from there, then you're not allowed to harvest. But if it's a place she'ata mevi that you're not going to be able to bring the Omer from there, like, for example, an irrigated field, this is the source for the Mishnah, then you're allowed to kotzel. So you can actually harvest your crop beforehand if it's a field where you can't bring the Omer from there because, let's say, it's an irrigated field. Ema, so now they say, why don't you say this? Why don't you explain the contradiction differently? Mimin she'ata mevi'ata kotzel. Mimin she'ata mevi'ata kotzel. From the type of grain you're supposed to bring, which is barley, you can't harvest. So you can't do your barley harvest before, but maybe you could do your wheat harvest before. Now, we learned already you can't do that, and that's what the Gemara is going to say. Ha'ula matzit amrit, you can't say that that's what the pasuk means, because midu Rabbi Yochanan. As we learned, Rabbi Yochanan said yesterday, he didn't say yesterday, he said in yesterday's daf, Rabbi Yochanan said that because we learned Reshik Tirchem from Reshit Arisotechem, which was the Chala, and Chala applies to all five, so the Reshik Tirchem applies to all five grains as well. So it has to be the first of all your grain harvest, all your five types of grains, and therefore you can't explain the contradiction in that way. Okay, now we get to the Anshe Yericho. Anshe Yericho, Kotzrim B'Ritzon Chachamim, Gochim Shelo B'Ritzon Chachamim. Remember, they would harvest, and that was okay with the rabbis. They would put it in piles, which was not right, and that was because it was irrigated fields. Then they would put it in piles, which was not okay with the rabbis, but lo michu biyadam. But the rabbis didn't protest. Now the Gemara says they know something that we don't know yet, which is man shamalei damar michu velo michu. Who's the one who talks about the Anshe Yericho and which cases the rabbis protested and which cases they didn't protest? Which means, who's our Mishnah like? Because we're going to see there's a machlokah between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir about the reactions to 6 different things that the Anshe Yericho were doing. And Rabbi Meir doesn't talk at all in the language of the rabbis protested, didn't protest. He doesn't use that language. He just uses the language of B'rtzon Chachamim, Shelo B'rtzon Chachamim. Okay, was it within what they wanted or not within the consent of the rabbis? Okay, or within the wishes of the rabbis. But he doesn't discuss did the rabbis protest or not protest. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who discusses that, which seems to imply that Rabbi Yehuda is the one who's talking in our Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says that Anshe Yericho kutzlim with the reshut of the Chachamim. They harvested in the rabbis with their approval. They put it in piles against the rabbis' approval, but the rabbis didn't stop them. We're assuming that's Rabbi Yehuda. Now, what's the problem? Well, v'sava Rabbi Yehuda. Does Rabbi Yehuda really think that the Anshe Yericho were doing the harvesting, the rabbis were okay with it? We're going to see that Rabbi Yehuda actually says the rabbis were not okay with the fact that they were harvesting before the Omer was brought. Okay, so then we're going to have a contradiction and we're going to have to resolve it. Because the bottom line assumption is, and this they don't veer from, is that our Mishnah must be Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, and then it contradicts what he says here. So now we're going to see the source, which we learned already in Pesachim, but that was a very long time ago. V'hatanya, it says in a Braita, Shisha dvarim asu anshe Yericho, shlosha b'rtzon chachamim, shlosha shelo b'rtzon chachamim. Okay, numbers, one of those number sources. We have 6 things they did, right? This is a great mnemonic. 3 the rabbis were pleased with, 3 the rabbis were not pleased with. Ve'elu sheb'rtzon chachamim. These are the ones the rabbis were pleased with. Markivim tkalim kol hayom. Okay, we have a lot of Pesach stuff going on in these dapim, which is very nice leading up to Pesach. Erev Pesach, you're not allowed to work really, okay? And especially in the afternoon. You're supposed to be getting ready for, in those days, it was also the Korban Pesach. If there wasn't a Korban, there's still Isra Malacha. It's a lot of things, as we all know, to get ready for on Leila Seder. So they would be grafting their palm trees all day, okay? Their date trees, they would be grafting them all day long. Now, it's a little bit weird that that's B'rtzon Chachamim. We're going to get back to this, okay? Why were the rabbis okay with this? It's not really okay to do, but this was okay with the rabbis. Korchim et Shema, which is different interpretations. Some people say they didn't take breaks in between the words, like they kind of slurred the words together as if they were like long words. Kutzlin lifnei Omer B'rtzon Chachamim, and they would harvest before the Omer, and that was all good with the rabbis. Ve'elu shelo B'rtzon Chachamim, okay, and this is not, the rabbis were not pleased with the following 3 things. This is all we're going to see Rabbi Meir's opinion. You notice he doesn't say michu lo michu. Well, at this point there was no point to say it, but even in the next part where they weren't pleased, he doesn't say, but they didn't protest, or they did protest. He doesn't make any mention. Ve'elu shelo b'rtzon chachamim. What did the rabbis, were they not pleased with? Number 1, godshim lifnei omer. They would make piles out of whatever they harvested. Mitirin gamziot shel hekdesh, shacharu v'shel shikma. They would take carob and sycamore trees that were sanctified. Now, if you sanctify a tree and then more branches grow, so they would take the branches and permit the use of the branches that grew after the sanctification was done. Now, if you sanctify a tree, the branches that grow from there should also be sanctified. So they were benefiting from them, and there was a problem. Because once the tree is sanctified, whatever growth there is should be problematic as well. And portzim pratzot beginotehem u'prodosotehem la'achil nishar l'aniyim b'shnei batzorot b'shabbatot b'yabim tovim. They would make openings in their gardens, like if they had a fence, they would open, make a breach in the fence, and in their orchards, in their gardens and orchards, in order to allow the fruits that would fall on Shabbat and Yom Tov to be eaten by the poor people. Now, what's the problem? You're not supposed to eat fruit that fell on Shabbat or Yom Tov, because so they were doing sort of a nice thing. They were helping out the poor people, but it's a problem, because if you eat fruits that fall, we're concerned. The Rambam says this is the concern. There's a bit of a debate because it's also a muktzah problem, but the Rambam claims that the issue is we're worried you're going to actually pick them. If we allow you to take ones that fell on the floor, you might actually pick off your tree. So, and yes, you're right. Shuli wrote on this. So thanks, Miriam, for sharing the link. Shuli wrote on this Braita when at the time. So if anybody wants to find it, you can search on our site. So now, says the following. Divrei Rabbi Meir. That's all Rabbi Meir. Those things the rabbis were not pleased with. Amar lo Rabbi Yehuda. Something doesn't jive with what you're saying. In Bertzon Chachamim Mosim, Yehu Kol Adam Mosim Ken. Okay, wait a minute. If those first three things are okay with the rabbis, meaning they're totally fine with it, then everyone should be allowed to do this. And we see they're not. Like, not everybody's doing this. This obviously isn't okay. None of those things are okay. So, Ela Elo ve'elo shelo Bertzon Chachamim. He says no. None of them are Bertzon Chachamim. It's just that al shlosha michu b'yadam, v'al shlosha lo michu b'yadam. He says the issue isn't whether the rabbi's pleased, whether the rabbi's not pleased. The rabbis weren't pleased with any of these six things. It's just a matter of, did they decide to make an issue of it and protest, or did they not? So on the first three, they weren't as bad. They didn't protest. On the second three, they were. But his first three and second three are a little different than Rabbi Meir, and here's going to be the problem. So again, shlosha michu, shlosha lo michu, ve'elu shelo michu b'yadam. So the first three, they didn't protest. What are those? Markivim tkalim kol hayom. The fact that they worked on Erev Pesach, so it wasn't great, but they allowed it. Right? Probably there was a bit of a hefsed involved also, a bit of a loss. Korchim et shma. So they would put the words together with the shma. It's not great, but they did say the words. I guess it seemed not terrible. Kotzlim v'godshim lifnei ha'omer. Okay, and then they would harvest before the Omer. Now, notice what they said, though. They would harvest and make the piles. Here's your problem. What does it say? Kutzlim shelo b'rtzon chachamim. The rabbis were not pleased with it. They just didn't protest. What does it say in our Mishnah? Kutzlim was actually b'rtzon chachamim. It was the Godshim that was the problem. So there's the contradiction, because if you assume that our Mishnah is Rabbi Yehuda, which they do, it contradicts what he says in this Braita. This Braita says Kutzlim was a problem. Not to mention, there's another problem, which is this actually becomes 4, not 3, because there's Kotzrim and Godshim. We're going to come back to that. Ve'elo shemichu b'yadan, and here's the 3 they protested, and that we're going to turn now to Amabet. Mitirin gamziyot shel hekdesh, shel charuv shel shikma. That's what we saw. They permitted the growths of the trees that were hekdesh. Portzim pratzot b'ginotehem pardosotehen kedei lachil nishar laniyim b'shnei batzor b'shabbatot b'yimim tovim. The second one. And, the one we saw before, which was the last one. And now he has another one on the list because he put Kotzrim and Godshim together. They were separate. Godshim was on the second list before, right? According to Rabbi Meir, V'notnim pe'ah liyarak. They would leave pe'ah for yarakot. Okay, now you're not supposed to do that. Okay, yarak are basically things that don't last, that can't be stored. And there's actually no obligation of pe'ah for it. Now, why is it a problem? Because if there's no obligation of pe'ah, then, when you leave something in your field, pe'ah, so the poor people take it and they don't have to do maser on it. But if you're not obligated in pe'ah, they have to take maser. Now, they don't know, they don't pay attention. They don't know what it is. Is it yarak? Is it not? And they think that, or maybe they think you meistered it already, and others, they're not going to meister it, and you're basically causing other people to sin. So that's the problem with the last one, umichu b'yadam, and the rabbis protested these 3. So now we have a problem again, because Ktsira, he said, was not Bertzon Chachamim, and in our Mishnah he said it was. So they say, V'litamech, but you have a problem anyway. In other words, there's a problem with this Braita. Forget about the problem of it contradicts our Mishnah. There's a problem with the Braita itself, as I mentioned before. Shisha shiva havu. It's not 6, it's 7 here. So the way to resolve all the problems is Elas sami mikan Ktsira. Get rid of Ktsira on the list. It's just the Godshim shelo b'rtzon chachamim. It must be a mistake. Someone by accident added Kotzrim to here. Kotzrim doesn't really belong. And then there's no contradiction. And then it also fits in with the numbers. And that's an easy way to resolve the problem. Okay, now we get to the complicated part of today's sugya. I will warn you, it's just a little bit tricky. Hopefully I'll make it clear enough. It won't be complicated. But I'll try to help also with what's important to understand here. Now, Kotzir l'shachar u'machil l'beima. Let's go through first, because we're going to come back to it. We're going to go to a completely different sugya, which actually is in pe'ah, but having nothing to do with the pe'ah we just mentioned. Same mitzvah, but a totally different issue. And then we're going to compare it to the opinions in our Mishnah. So let's review our Mishnah when it comes to Kotzir l'shachat. And I'll repeat what I said at the time, which is, according to Tanakama, Kotzir l'shachat machil l'beima. If you harvest it for your animal, it's permitted. Why? Because that is not called ktsira. Remember this. It's very important. It's not ktsira if you cut it for your animal. Rabbi Yehuda came and said that's only if it didn't reach a third of its growth, and we assume that Rabbi Yehuda and the rabbis agree with each other. Okay, Rabbi Yehuda and the Tanakama, that's all one opinion. It's not called ktsira as long as it's under a third and you're doing it for animals. Comes Rabbi Shimon and says, even past a third, if you're doing it for animals, it's not ktsira. Those are the 2 opinions. Now we move to this Mishnah in Peah, which has to do with something else about not ktsira. Okay, we're going to have a same thing of is something called ktsira or not ktsira, and we're going to compare it. What we're going to do is we're going to bring this machloka between Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. We're not really going to talk about Rabbi Meir, the rabbis much. We're going to talk about Rabbi Meir. And we're going to basically try to say, first they're going to say Rabbi Meir seems to be like Rabbi Shimon in the Mishnah. Then they're going to say, no, can't possibly be, because of some contradiction with the Braita, and the only way to resolve it is to say this. Then we're going to say, oh, Rabbi Meir must be holding by Rabbi Yehuda then in the Mishnah. And then they're going to also reject that. And then they're going to bring in some ringer, like a third opinion that we haven't even heard of, Rabbi Akiva, and say Rabbi Meir must match that. Even then they're going to have an issue, but then they're going to sort of resolve the issue, okay? Resolve it in a bit of a stretch manner. But that's going to be our sugya. So at least you have the structure right now, and now let's go into it. Tananatam, it says there in the Mishnah, in Pe'ah, Elu mafsikin lepe'ah. In Pe'ah, what you have to do is you have to leave a corner of your field. Okay, the rabbi said it's 1/60th, but by Torah law, it's, leave some corner of your field. What is called a field? What defines this field as one field and a separate field, or you have to leave one corner for the entire section, or do you have to leave two, one corner for this one corner for that one? So there's rules about what determines what separates a field. This is what's important for our purposes. So, hanachal, if you have a stream going in between two fields, then they're designated as two separate fields. Right? Mafsikin lepe'ah means this is a separator. Okay? Because it's a separator, we're going to say this field is chayav and peh, and that field is chayav and peh separately. You're going to have to leave a corner of this one and a corner of that one. Okay, we've seen this, by the way. I see now it comes up in Bava Batra and Bava Kama. Okay, so if it sounds familiar, that's because we've seen it. If it doesn't sound familiar, it's okay. You're not supposed to remember everything. Hashlulit. Okay, shlulit could be a big puddle that separates, or likely it's more, some people translate it as a channel that goes in between two fields, which is like a stream. Derech hayachid v'derech harabim, ushvila rabim, ushvila yachid. Okay, I won't get into why they have to mention all these four, because once you have one, you could imply others, but we're going to leave that issue aside for right now, because I want to stay focused. But this is either a path meant for individuals to go through, which is 4 amot wide, or a path made for public to go through, which is 16 cubits wide, or a shvil harabim and a shvila yachid. Now, a path is not the same as a road, right? Like a road is a much more similar, it's 4 amot or 16 amot, but a path is something that's narrower than 4, but people use it, or narrower than 16, but the public goes through it. And if you want to say a path, though, then it has to be kavua b'yimot hachama b'yimot kshamim. It has to be a path that people use all year long. Many paths people use only in the summer when everything was dried and the crops weren't growing. Okay, but when the crops are growing in the winter, people wouldn't pass through certain areas. Okay, plus because number one, things were growing, or number two, it was all muddy. Okay, but if it serves as a path all year round, then even a path is enough to say this separates fields. Habul. Bul is not a bore like a pit. It's an uncultivated field. So if you have 2 fields that are cultivated and stuff is growing, and in the middle you have a field that just lays fallow, then that separates between your other 2 fields. Your 2 fields are no longer connected because of the fallow field in between. Hanir, if you basically have the same structure, 2 fields on the sides, 1 in the middle, and the one in the middle is plowed, okay, not planted. So that would also separate. Vizera acher, if you have all your fields are one type, and then in between all your one type, you have a different type that separates. So that's also a separator, and then your fields are considered separate. Here's the key, okay? All of those are irrelevant. HaKotzer l'shachat mafsik. Okay, here you have to understand the issue. If you start, let's start with the basic, not this case. I start harvesting my field, and I decide I'm harvesting the one in the middle of 2 other fields. If I harvest it, and it's called ktsira, this is why it's similar to our Mishnah, because if we call it ktsira in the Omer, then it's a problem, because it's no longer reshit for the Omer, right? If I start harvesting a field in a normal manner, I can't do that because I have to do it only for the Omer, right? I have to do the first one for the Omer. And I have to wait till Tet Zayin, Nisan. But if it's not ktsira, then I'm allowed to do it, like I do it for my animal, let's say. So now, here we're going to have the same definition. Is this ktsira, is it not ktsira? What determines something as being ktsira? So if I harvest it, because I'm harvesting, okay, I cut it because I'm harvesting, then I'm just starting my harvest. And let's say I happen to harvest the field in the middle of 2 other fields. I'm just beginning my harvesting. So we just view it as I'm starting my harvest. It's not like I'm leaving a field that's going to be laying fallow in between 2 other fields and it's going to separate. No, if I'm harvesting, it doesn't separate. But that's why the Mishnah says, Kotzer l'shachat mafsik. If I harvest it or I cut it for the sake of animal fodder to give it to my animals, then, okay, now, this is a little confusing because later we're going to see that Rabbi Meir doesn't even distinguish whether it's for animals or not for animals, but we'll talk about that later. Kotzer l'shachat mafsik. Okay, now in our Mishnah it said kotzer l'shachat machil lebehema. It doesn't say here machil lebehema. Okay, that's going to be an issue. Just keep it in your head. We don't know this yet, but as long as you're cutting it when it's shachat, okay, or we don't know exactly what he means here. We're going to get back to it. But your kotzer, let's say we assume this means for your animal to eat. Well, then it's empty, and you don't do the two fields around it. Then it separates. Okay, because why? Because kotzer l'shachat is not ktsira. You see how this exactly matches the idea in our Mishnah that if you're kotzer l'shachat, it's not ktsira. Okay, it's not considered harvesting. So now the question is, okay, v'chachamim obrim, sorry, one more thing. Chachamim obrim, em mafsik elim ken charash. He says, unless you plowed, just because you harvested it for animal fodder doesn't mean anything. That's still harvesting. The only way it's going to be a separator is if you plow. Okay, if you don't plow, it's not a separator because you could say that's the beginning of the harvest, or we're not sure what the rabbi's opinion is exactly based on, but that's what he says. So now we're going to figure out, who does Rabbi Meir hold like? Because Rabbi Meir does seem to hold like our Mishnah, but like which opinion in our Mishnah? So Rabbi Meir, b'shitat Rabbi Shimon amara, so Rabbi Yochanan is quoted as saying, Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi Shimon, da'amar yiktzor v'yachil af m'shei v'yashlish. Because if you notice, he never said, is it shlish, not shlish, right? Rabbi Yehuda said, Achaloi v'shlish. Rabbi Shimon said, Af Mishei v'yashlish. Rabbi Meir doesn't say anything. Does it have to be a third of the way grown, under a third, or could it be even more, as long as you're doing it for fodder? So the first opinion of they bring of Rabbi Yochanan is, he must be saying, even Mishei v'yashlish. If you cut it for the sake of your animal, it's not called ktsira. If it's not called ktsira, then you've basically left this field fallow in the middle, right? Again, only if you're starting your harvesting do we say, well, you're just starting your harvesting and you happen to do it in between these two fields, but you're going to continue. But if you're doing it for animal, then it's not considered the beginning of your harvest, and therefore it will be a separator between your fields for peah. But we're going to have a problem with this. Why? Okay, so first they say, Alma kasavar, he must hold kol l'shachat lav tzira. They assume he means any case you're doing it for your animal, it's called, right, it's not ktsira. Like Rabbi Shimon. The problem is some other source. Yativ Rabba v'ka'amar la lahashmata. So Rabba was sitting and he said the following thing. We taught what Rabbi Yochanan taught. Eitive Rav Acha bar Huna l'Rava. So Rav Acha bar Huna turns to Rava and says, we have a different source that seems to contradict this theory. Achalach hagav kersimor nimalim. If grasshoppers came and ate the field. Okay, this is what you call ktsira, not by my wishes, right? It got harvested on its own, okay? Decimated, you could call it. Kirsimor nimalim, the ants ate away at the field. Shivarta ruach, or the wind came and blew everything away, ruined the field. Hakol modim, they all agree in this case. Charash mafsik, lo charash eno mafsik. Only if you plowed it is it going to be a separator. Now, who is hakol modim? Everyone agrees. Well, obviously, the rabbis already said it in the normal case. It has to be plowed for it to be a separator. So hakol modim man Rabbi Meir, must be Rabbi Meir. Now, let's try to figure out how this works in with our case. Because why does he require plowing here and he doesn't require plowing to be a separator in the Mishnah and Peah? This, by the way, is a Tosefta that we just read. So, Iyamar Bishma, basically I'm going to say this outside and then we'll read it inside. The only way to resolve the contradiction is to say that Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah must be talking about only before it got to a third of its way. In this case, where the crops were eaten by the animals or ruined by the creatures and ruined by the wind, must be after it already reached a third. And then you're going to see that Rabbi Meir can't hold by Rabbi Shimon because he only thinks it's if it's under a third. Okay, and that's going to be the assumption for the rest of the sugya. Okay, that to resolve that contradiction, you have to say Rabbi Meir was talking only under a third. And then it can't match Rabbi Shimon who says even over a third, it's not ktsira. So that's what we're going to read right now. If you're going to say the Mishnah in Pe'ah is when it's not a third yet, and then we're going to say if you harvested your field for your animals, or now we're going to get to even for people, anything under a third is not considered a harvest. Okay? Braita de charash in lo charash lo, but the braita, when it's saying only if you plowed it, is b'shevi shlish, when it reached a third. And that's going to work, and that's going to make sense. The only way to read that braita, because we're now going to say the way that doesn't work. Because Ela Iyamar, what Rabbi Yochanan tried to say, which is Rabbi Meir holds like Rabbi Shimon, even if it reached a third, we're still going to, as long as you did it for your animal, we're not going to care. It's not harvesting. Well, Iyamar nitinami b'shevi shlish, if the Mishnah impairs also where it reached a third, hashta uma hatam, diktsira de adam. It's not the hatam, it should be the adam. When you yourself do it, a person does the reaping. Amar Rabbi Meir lo shma ktsira. Rabbi Meir doesn't call it ktsira, harvesting, right? In other words, if you say more than a third, it's not harvesting. Hacha lo kol sheken. All the more so, if animals ate it, that's really not a harvest. And then, of course, you're not going to call it harvesting. And if it's not harvesting, what's the opposite? If it's not harvesting, it creates a separation. And that's not what it says about the grasshoppers and the ants. The grasshoppers and the ants, or the wind ruins it. It is not a separator. It's considered as if it was like almost the beginning of your harvest, unless you plow the field. If you plow the field, yes, not. So you can't possibly, this case is less likely to have gotten to that. So if they're both the same, shlish, right there, they're beyond a shlish, then it makes absolutely no sense. So the only way to resolve that contradiction is to say that Ela Rabbi Meir, okay, so Hachalakoshkin, so therefore the only way to resolve the contradiction between the Tosefta and the Mishnah is to say that obviously Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah is talking about it's not harvesting if you did it at less than a third, you reaped it. And then we're going to talk about it very soon. It's not going to make a difference, human, whether you're doing it for people or you're doing it for animals, because notice Rabbi Meir doesn't say anything about lachilat behema. So now, if that's the case, well then the obvious is, okay, he doesn't hold like Rabbi Shimon. Who does he hold like? Rabbi Yehuda. So Ela Rabbi Meir b'shitat Rabbi Yehuda Amara da'amar imatai b'zman shitchilat shelo hevi shlish avalim itchilat shevi shlish asul. Right now it's perfect, because if Rabbi Meir in this Mishnah in Peah is saying, as long as you harvested when it's under a third, right? Basically, we're going to say it's a separator because it's not ktsira. That matches Rabbi Yehuda, who says it's not ktsira if you harvested it for your animals under a third, right? We don't call that ktsira, and therefore it's permitted to do before the omer, before you harvest the omer. It's the same idea. However, what's the problem? Because Imar deshamalei Rabbi Yehuda lebehema la'adam yishamatlei. But Rabbi Yehuda was specifically talking about Tanakama, kotzer l'shachat machil lebehema. And then he said, when is that? Ad shelo hevi shlish. It's only for your animal. And Rabbi Meir seems to say, even if it's for humans, it's fine. Now, Rabbi Meir seems to say he doesn't care whether you're cutting it for animals, you're cutting it for humans. All he cares about is it a third or not a third? If it's under a third, won't be harvesting. It'll be a separator. Whether you're doing it for humans or not for humans. Now, we'll see in a minute what the humans is. What are you doing it for humans? Humans don't eat it. Well, at a third, you can actually roast them. You can toast them and make crunchy things out of them that humans can eat. So we're going to assume that Rabbi Meir holds that way because he doesn't say anything about doing it for animals, which means he doesn't seem to hold like Rabbi Yehuda. And if you want to say, maybe Rabbi Yehuda is saying that, because notice in Rabbi Yehuda's words, all he says is, Matai ad shelo hevi shlish. He doesn't say anything about animals. But if he doesn't think it's for animals, then, so now, im kain havalu tlata tanai. If we're going to say that Rabbi Yehuda thinks, even if you're doing it for humans, like let's say for klayot, for roasted treats, well, then you're going to have three opinions in the Mishnah: Tanakama, Rabbi Yehuda, and Rabbi Shimon. And what did we say? Whenever Rabbi Yehuda says Matai, he's agreeing with Tanakama and just explaining him. So if you would want to suggest that Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda say the same thing, and both of them think that even if you're doing it for humans, as long as it's under a third, that's all we care about, well, then you're going to have three opinions in the Mishnah, because the rabbis say, Kotzer l'shachat machil lebehema, only for your animal. Rabbi Yehuda comes and says, as long as it's a third, even for humans. And then Rabbi Shimon says, even if it's more than a third, it doesn't matter. So then you'd have three opinions, and that's not the structure of the Mishnah there, of the our Mishnah in Menachot, okay, as opposed to the Mishnah in Peah. Okay, that's not it. So therefore, it can't work. Ela ki ata Rav Dimi amar Rabbi Meir b'shita Rabbi Akiva Rabbo amar. Okay, now he says, Meir must hold like Rabbi Akiva's rabbi, who says, Af la'adam nami lo havya ktsira. Even for Adam, it's not ktsira. And now we're going to see that Rabbi Akiva holds, as long as it's not reached a shlish, right? It hasn't gotten to a third. If you harvest it even for humans, and that's going to perfectly match Rabbi Meir. Okay, Ditnan. How do we know this? Because here's Rabbi Akiva. Haminamer sadeh v'shir bo klachim lachim. If you make, a namer is a leopard, What it means is you do one row, yes, one row not. You harvest one row, not the next. Okay, so you keep harvesting every other field. So if you do it like that and you leave not fully ripe produce, Rabbi Akiva Omer, pe'ah lechol echad ve'echad. That's going to be, you're going to need pe'ah in each field. Chachamim omrim me'echad al hakol. No, it's still one field, okay? Because you were just doing, he still views this as a whole field, because what were you doing? You were choosing the ones that are fully ripe and not the ones that aren't fully ripe. So you're basically, choosing what you're doing, but you started your harvest. So of course they're not considered separators. Now, here comes the key. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel, lo chayev Rabbi Akiva ela b'minamer liklayot. Now, until now, it sounded like, okay, these are 80% ripe and those are 100% ripe, right? So you did the 80% you left, the 100% you harvested. But Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, we're talking about that you harvested ones for klayot. That's why you picked every other one, because you were picking. It's not like you specifically wanted to do alternating, but you did it because you wanted to take some for yourself to eat as early stage, okay, to roast them. Aval b'minamer lo otzar lo. But if you're picking every other one, alternating fields for the purpose of storing it because it's ready already and just some are more ripe than the others, well, that's obviously the beginning of your harvest. Okay, you're just harvesting them as they are ready. So that is a perfect answer for Rabbi Meir, because then Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda are saying the same thing. Even if you do it for human, as long as it's under a third, that's going to be a separator. More than a third, not. And that seems to work perfectly. There's one problem. What's the problem? Ini, is that really true? When Ravin came from Israel, he said that Rabbi Yochanan didn't understand it the way Shmuel understood it. He said it's even if it's 80, some are 80% and some are 100%, and you're doing the 100% ones, and you're doing them to store, which means that Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Meir are not saying the same thing. To which the Gemara answers, okay, this is what you call lifting up your hands in surrender. Okay, this was not an easy sugya. It was not easy to figure out who does Rabbi Meir hold like. He doesn't seem to hold like Rabbi Shimon, because Rabbi Shimon says even after a third, and for the Chagavim we saw the only way to resolve it is to say that's more than a third, this is less than a third. It can't be Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda says only for animals, and Rabbi Meir says even for human consumption, or at least didn't seem to say anything about animals, so there was no reason to think that he didn't think that. And now we can't say like Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva even thinks more than a shlish, right? More than a third would be fine. So how are we going to resolve it? A very weak kind of answer, but he agrees with Rabbi Akiva in a case where it's less than a third, and he doesn't agree with Rabbi Akiva when it's more than a third, but he does agree with him about the basic thing. Even for human consumption, it could work. Now, according to Rabbi Akiva, takes it much farther, because he says even if past a third, you can even say this is just, if you're doing it every other, alternating fields, you're actually creating separators. Akiva has a completely different approach, and that's why it's a little hard to say Rabbi Meir. And the commentaries try to kind of figure out and say maybe we're reinterpreting Rabbi Meir now, that if you choose alternating fields, then you're not actually doing the beginning of your harvest. But that's a whole question of itself. We're going to end here. In the end, they do come up with Rabbi Akiva, but he doesn't really fully hold like Rabbi Akiva. He only partially holds like him, and we're kind of stuck at the end without a really good answer as to who Rabbi Meir holds like. Okay, review of our sugya. We started with the source for Hashrasha being the source. We went through 4 till we finally got to the final one. The 4th one was the answer. We went through all the heterim. How can you actually, harvest before the Omer, and what's the scenarios? Then we had all sorts of ideally do the mitzvah this way, but if you do it another way, it's okay. We mentioned this thing about the Anshe Yericho. They were doing this Shalom B'Ratzon Chachamim, but the Chachamim didn't stop them, which again is a whole interesting issue of see people doing something wrong. What's your, where do you draw the line on what you're going to make an issue of, what you're not? From there, we got into the Gemara. We mentioned this contradiction that led us to saying, well, there are some fields you actually can harvest. And then we got to the Anshe Yericho. It said that seems to match Rabbi Yehuda, but that contradicts what Rabbi Yehuda says in this source that's quoted in Pesachim. And we said, okay, it must be there was a mistake there. Get rid of Kotzlim, and then we don't have a contradiction. And then we ended with the sugya of this opinion of Rabbi Meir that certain kind of ktsira is not ktsira, actually, which is the same concept as in our Mishnah. The question is, who does it match? In the end, it doesn't match anyone in our Mishnah. And we only found Rabbi Akiva that matches, and even that was a partial match and not a complete match. That we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day.